My name is Isabella. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my life, I've been described with words that sound kind, but are usually meant to make me smaller, easygoing, reasonable, the calm one. I'm a wife, a sister, a daughter, someone people lean on when things get uncomfortable, because I don't raise my voice, and I don't demand to be seen. From the outside, that calm has often been mistaken for compliance, or worse, for ignorance. People tend to underestimate me. They assume that because I listen more than I speak, I must be unsure. That is because I try to understand before I judge. I must not see clearly. I've learned that when you move quietly, others feel free to speak loudly around you, and to say things they never expect you to remember. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about exposing anyone for the sake of humiliation, and it's not about winning. It's about truth. What happens when one person in a family system refuses to unsee what everyone else is committed to denying? I was cast out by my entire family for being the only one who spoke the truth about my brother. Not in anger, not dramatically, but clearly. And the betrayal that followed didn't happen in secret. It happened under my roof, in plain sight, turning my marriage and my family into something I could no longer recognize. What you're about to hear is the emotional journey of how that kind of betrayal unfolds slowly. How it starts with small dismissals that are easy to excuse. How silence, at first a survival instinct, can become a deliberate choice. And how quiet observation, when paired with moral clarity, can shift the balance of power without ever raising its voice. This is a story about being assigned a role you never agreed to play. About being useful, reliable, invisible. About watching patterns repeat until you finally understand that what's happening isn't accidental, it's structural. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. There are no villains twirling mustaches here. Just ordinary people protecting the version of reality that benefits them most. There are no explosive confrontations, no screaming matches. What happens instead is slower, colder, and far more irreversible. I'll tell the story honestly, with restraint, with care. Not to punish anyone, but to name what happens when truth threatens a family's internal balance, and how the person who carries that truth often pays the price first. If you've ever been the one who noticed what others worked hard not to notice, if you've ever been labeled difficult simply for being accurate, then you might recognize yourself somewhere in what follows. Before we begin, let me ask you, gently, have you ever wondered why families sometimes reject the truth teller more fiercely than the one who caused the harm? To my family, I was predictable, dependable, the one who showed up early and stayed late, the one who remembered birthdays without reminders and smoothed over tense silences at dinner by asking safe questions. If there was a problem, I was expected to help solve it, but never to name it. I learned early that my value wasn't in being right, it was in being useful. Growing up, my brother was the gravity around which everything else revolved. His mood set the tone of the house. His mistakes were reframed as misunderstandings. His successes, real or exaggerated, were celebrated loudly, repeatedly. I was the contrast, the easy child, the one who didn't need much, the one who was so strong they forgot to ask how I was actually doing. When relatives described us, they always used the same structure. He's complicated, but brilliant. She's steady, thank God. As if steadiness were a personality rather than a coping mechanism. I didn't resent him for that. Not consciously. I told myself families need different roles filled, and I had simply been assigned mine. I became good at it. I learned how to read rooms, how to anticipate needs before they were spoken, how to absorb tension so others could stay comfortable. I was praised for being mature. What no one said out loud was that maturity, in my case, meant silence. By the time I married, that role followed me seamlessly into adulthood. My parents trusted me with logistics, not opinions. My brother called me when he needed a favor, not advice. Family gatherings ran more smoothly when I was there, and no one questioned why, because no one questioned the labor of emotional regulation when it was done quietly by someone else. Even my husband absorbed that version of me without ever asking if it was accurate. To him, I was calm, grounded. The woman who didn't get dramatic. He liked to tell people that I was the stable one in the family, the rational anchor. At the time, I took that as a compliment. Only later did I understand how easily stability can be confused with passivity. What's strange is that I was never invisible in a literal sense. People saw me, they relied on me, They just didn't listen when I spoke about things that disrupted the narrative they preferred. If I raised a concern, it was brushed aside with reassurance. If I noticed a pattern, it was reframed as overthinking. The message was consistent. You're perceptive, but not about this. So I learned to soften my words, to preface truth with disclaimers. I might be wrong, but it's probably nothing, I just thought. Eventually, even that felt unnecessary. It was easier to observe and store things away quietly than to push against a system that rewarded my silence. In family photos from those years, I'm always slightly to the side, leaning in but not centered, smiling but not brightly. At the time, I thought that meant I was modest, low maintenance. What it really meant was that I had adapted myself to fit into the negative space of everyone else's certainty. I didn't feel oppressed. That's important to say. There was no single dramatic incident, no obvious cruelty, just a steady erosion of my authority over my own perception. A subtle training that taught me, you can see clearly, but you don't get to decide what it means. And because I didn't fight that assumption, it calcified. By the time the real fractures began, long before anyone else noticed them, I had already been categorized: reliable, neutral, safe. I was the person you trusted to hold things together, not the person you expected to name when something was wrong. That misunderstanding would later cost me my place in the family. But at this stage, I didn't know that yet. All I knew was that I was valued for what I absorbed, not for what I revealed. And I told myself that was enough, that being the calm one meant being the good one. It took years to understand that invisibility doesn't always come from being ignored. Sometimes it comes from being seen only in the role that makes everyone else comfortable. The first moment that stayed with me wasn't loud. It didn't come with raised voices or slammed doors. That's probably why no one else remembers it. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that blends into memory unless something quietly shifts. We were all at my house, my parents, my brother, and my husband. I had offered to host because I always did. The table was set, the food already warming in the oven, the kind of domestic order that made everyone feel taken care of without having to acknowledge who did the taking care. At some point, my brother started telling a story about a disagreement he'd had at work. I remember the way he framed it, him as the misunderstood one, the other person as unreasonable. It was a familiar structure. Everyone leaned in, nodding, ready to validate. Halfway through, he said something small but off, a detail that didn't line up with what he'd told me privately a few weeks earlier. I didn't interrupt him, I didn't challenge him, I simply asked a clarifying question. Didn't you say before that the deadline had already passed? The room shifted, not dramatically, just enough. A pause that lasted a second too long. My brother laughed it off, waving his hand as if I'd misunderstood something obvious. No, you're mixing things up, he said lightly. Before I could respond, my mother stepped in. Isabella always remembers things wrong, she said with a smile, as if it were a charming quirk. She gets details jumbled. There it was, the first small cut. Not the disagreement. That would have been normal. It was the speed with which my perception was dismissed. The ease with which everyone accepted that I must be mistaken, without any curiosity, without even checking. I felt my husband's hand rest on my back, a gesture meant to calm. It's not important, he murmured. You know how these things get fuzzy. I nodded. I always nodded. Outwardly, I let it go. Inwardly, something tightened. Not anger, confusion. A quiet recalibration. I replayed the memory in my head, checking it for errors, the way I'd been trained to do. But the more I examined it, the clearer it became. I wasn't wrong. What unsettled me wasn't that my brother had rewritten the story. People do that all the time. What unsettled me was how quickly the system moved to protect him, and how naturally I was positioned as the unreliable one. No one accused me outright. That would have been easier to confront. Instead, they smiled, they reassured, they smoothed it over, and in doing so, they established something new, a precedent. After that day, it happened again and again. Small things, dates, promises, who said what. Each time, if my memory contradicted my brother's version, the same correction occurred. You're probably remembering it differently. He didn't mean it that way. Why are you making such a big deal out of nothing? I started to notice how often nothing seemed to involve my perception being quietly overwritten. What made it harder to trust myself was the way everyone else seemed so confident. They weren't defensive, they weren't aggressive, they were certain. And certainty, when shared by a group, has a way of feeling like truth, even when it isn't. I didn't protest. I didn't keep score, at least not consciously. I just started paying closer attention. I noticed how my brother's stories always placed him in the best possible light, how accountability slipped off him like water, how my parents filled in the gaps for him before anyone asked, and how my husband, eager to keep the peace, mirrored their responses without malice, but without reflection either. I told myself it was family dynamics, old habits. Nothing is worth disrupting harmony over. I told myself I was being sensitive, analytical, difficult. But there's a particular kind of hurt that comes from being calmly told your reality is incorrect, especially when it happens in your own home. That afternoon ended the way they all did. Plates cleared, coffee poured, polite goodbyes, no visible damage. But something had been marked. The cut was small enough to dismiss, small enough to ignore, small enough to repeat. Once something happens more than once, it stops feeling like an accident. At first, I still gave everyone the benefit of the doubt. I told myself that memory is slippery, that families miscommunicate, that no one was intentionally undermining me. I had spent most of my life being generous with explanations for other people's behavior. It felt unnatural to stop. So when my brother forgot commitments he'd made, plans he'd initiated, favors he'd requested, and then insisted they'd never been discussed, I adjusted. I started sending follow-up messages, casual and friendly, just confirming what we talked about earlier. When those messages went unanswered, I let it go. When my parents relayed information to me that conflicted with what they'd told me days earlier, I assumed they were overwhelmed. When I gently pointed out the discrepancy, they laughed. "You're too detail-oriented," my father said once. "You read too much into things." The strange part was how quickly that phrase lodged itself in my mind. Too detail-oriented. As if noticing patterns were a flaw rather than a skill. As if clarity were a kind of obsession. I began to edit myself in real time. If I felt the impulse to correct something, I paused. Is this worth it? If I sensed a familiar twist of reality happening mid-conversation, I swallowed it. It's not that serious. Over time, silence felt less like a choice and more like a reflex. What normalized the disrespect wasn't cruelty. It was repetition paired with warmth. No one was unkind to me. They thanked me, complimented me, relied on me. They just didn't grant authority to my perspective when it threatened the equilibrium they preferred. And because I wasn't overtly mistreated, I struggled to name what was happening. There was no clear boundary being crossed, no line I could point to and say, "There, that's it." Instead, there was a gradual conditioning. My version of events was always negotiable. My husband played a role in this too, though not intentionally. When I expressed discomfort after family gatherings, he listened, but with a tone that suggested reassurance rather than curiosity. "I'm sure they didn't mean it like that," he'd say. "You know your brother, he exaggerates. Maybe you're taking it personally." Each response was gentle. Each one chipped away at my confidence just enough to keep me quiet. I started to notice something else then. How much effort it took to maintain harmony. I was constantly translating myself into something more palatable, softer, less precise. I learned which observations would be met with resistance and which would be absorbed without comment. Invisibility, I realized, isn't always imposed. Sometimes it's negotiated, one concession at a time. The more I normalized the dismissals, the more they escalated. Not dramatically, but predictably. My brother began speaking over me in group conversations. My parents began redirecting discussions when I introduced inconvenient facts. My husband began summarizing my thoughts for me, often inaccurately, but with the assumption that he was helping. And I let it happen. Part of me believed that staying quiet was maturity. Insisting on being heard would make me difficult. I had been praised my whole life for being low maintenance. I didn't want to lose that identity, even as it hollowed out something essential. But internally, a record was forming. I started remembering everything, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Dates, phrases, expressions. The way my brother's tone shifted when he was cornered. The way my mother avoided eye contact when a contradiction surfaced. The way my husband's comfort with the family dynamic outweighed his discomfort with my unease. I didn't write anything down yet. I didn't confront anyone. I just watched. And in watching, I began to understand that this wasn't about isolated incidents. It was about roles being reinforced through microcorrections. About who was allowed to define reality and who was expected to adapt to it. The most dangerous part of that realization was how reasonable it all looked from the outside. No one would have believed me if I'd tried to explain it then. I barely believed myself. I was surrounded by calm voices, warm dinners, polite concern. There were no villains to point to, only a system that quietly taught me my clarity was disruptive. So I stayed. I adapted. I told myself that love meant flexibility and that families were imperfect. What I didn't realize was that by normalizing the disrespect, I was teaching them exactly how far they could go. And they were paying very close attention. It became clear to me slowly, the way you notice the shape of a room only after you've been living in it for years. I wasn't just being dismissed. I was being used. Not maliciously, not consciously, but consistently. My role had solidified into something very specific. The stabilizer. The one who absorbed tension so others didn't have to. The one who kept things running smoothly while staying emotionally interchangeable. I was the person you called when something needed fixing, not when something needed questioning. My parents leaned on me heavily by then. If there was a family conflict, they came to me to help mediate, never to hear my perspective, but to translate someone else's feelings into something more manageable. "You're so good at understanding people," my mother would say, handing me someone else's emotional mess like a task. My brother, on the other hand, treated me like a resource. He'd call when he needed support, validation, or help untangling consequences. If I offered insight that implied responsibility, he grew distant. If I reassured him, he relaxed. The pattern was unmistakable. And my husband, my partner, had unconsciously accepted this role for me as well. When I expressed discomfort, he framed it as stress. When I pointed out inconsistencies, he framed them as misunderstandings. He trusted my emotional regulation more than my judgment. I was reliable, useful, invisible. The realization didn't come with outrage. It came with a kind of quiet grief, because I understood then that this role had benefits, for everyone but me. It allowed my family to function without friction. It allowed my marriage to avoid conflict. And it allowed my brother to continue being protected from the consequences of his own behavior. What it didn't allow was truth. Once I saw the role clearly, I started noticing how everyone worked to keep me in it. Not aggressively, subtly, praise when I complied, withdrawal when I didn't, confusion when I asserted myself, relief when I backed down. It was behavioral conditioning, delivered with smiles. I also began to see how little space there was for me to change, without destabilizing the system. Any deviation from my assigned role was treated as a problem to be corrected. If I spoke firmly, I was overwhelmed. If I asked for accountability, I was being hard on him. If I pulled back emotionally, I was shutting people out. The message was clear. My presence was welcome only as long as I performed predictably. I didn't confront anyone about this realization. There was no point. The system didn't need my agreement to continue operating. It only needed my participation. So instead of reacting, I did something different. I stopped explaining myself. Not dramatically. I didn't announce a boundary. I simply noticed how often I had been justifying my perceptions, and I let that habit go. When something felt wrong, I didn't rush to smooth it over. When my brother contradicted himself, I didn't rush to clarify. I allowed silence to sit where my labor used to be. The reaction was immediate and telling. People became uneasy. Conversations stalled. My absence of reassurance created discomfort they didn't know how to name. My mother asked if I was okay. My husband asked if something was bothering me. My brother grew irritable. Nothing had changed on the surface, but underneath, the system was adjusting to the loss of one of its stabilizing forces. And that's when I understood something critical. My invisibility had been functional. It wasn't an oversight. It was a feature. I had been assigned the role of emotional buffer. And by stepping even slightly outside of it, I was disrupting something deeply entrenched. That was the moment I stopped asking myself whether I was imagining things. Because imagination doesn't provoke resistance. Truth does. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic exit. It happened on a day so ordinary that I almost missed it. I was standing in my kitchen early in the morning, the house quiet, the light just beginning to reach across the floor. My husband was still asleep. The world felt paused, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't bracing myself for anyone else's needs. I don't remember what triggered it exactly. It may have been something small, a message from my brother asking for help with something he'd created himself. Or maybe it was the way my mother had called the night before, already framing his latest situation before I could ask a question. Whatever it was, it landed differently that morning. Instead of the familiar reflex, to respond, to assist, to absorb, I felt something settle into place. Clarity. It wasn't emotional. There was no anger in it. Just a clean, almost mathematical understanding. This will not change if I keep participating the same way. I realized then that I had been waiting for permission to take myself seriously. Permission that was never going to come from them. That morning, I made coffee and sat at the table without my phone. I let the quiet stretch, and I asked myself a question I'd been avoiding for years. What do I actually know? Not what I suspected. Not what I feared. What I knew. I knew my brother lied. Selectively, convincingly, and often. Not about everything. Just about the things that protected his self-image. I knew my parents helped him do it. Not because they were cruel, but because they couldn't tolerate the alternative. I knew my husband preferred harmony over accuracy, and that my calm had made it easier for him to choose comfort. And I knew without doubt that every time I spoke up, the system moved to correct me, not the problem. None of this was new information. What was new was my willingness to stop minimizing it. I didn't feel empowered in a cinematic way. I felt sober, grounded, almost heavy. Because clarity carries responsibility, and I could sense that whatever came next would require restraint rather than reaction. That day, I didn't change my behavior outwardly. I answered messages politely, I listened, I nodded, but internally, something had detached. I stopped assuming good faith where there was a pattern of harm. I stopped interpreting dismissal as misunderstanding. I stopped confusing calm with consent. Later that evening, my brother came over unannounced. He talked about a problem he was facing, one that, unsurprisingly, had been caused by choices he'd made and misrepresented. He spoke with the expectation that I would validate him, reassure him, and help him find a way out. I listened, and when he finished, I said nothing. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I no longer felt obligated to rescue him from his own narrative. The silence unsettled him. He filled it quickly, justifying, reframing, minimizing. I watched how uncomfortable he became without my usual affirmation. That observation alone confirmed everything I had realized that morning. After he left, my husband asked if everything was okay. I told him it was. And it was, just not in the way he meant. That night, lying in bed, I understood that the shift wasn't about becoming louder or more assertive. It was about becoming unavailable for manipulation, about withdrawing emotional labor without announcing it, about choosing discernment over explanation. I didn't yet know what I would do with what I knew. I only knew that I would no longer offer clarity to people who used it to protect illusions. That was the day my silence stopped being automatic. It became intentional. An intention, I would learn, changes everything. Once silence became intentional, it took on a different texture. Before, my quiet had been reactive, an instinct shaped by years of being dismissed. Now it was deliberate, observant, almost architectural. I was no longer withholding out of fear, but out of discernment. And that distinction mattered more than anyone realized. I began responding more slowly, not coldly, just without urgency. Messages that once would have triggered immediate reassurance were met with neutral acknowledgement. Conversations that had relied on my emotional scaffolding were allowed to stand on their own. At first, no one noticed. They were accustomed to my presence, not my participation. As long as I showed up physically, the assumption was that I was still doing the internal work that kept everything balanced. But over time, the absence of that labor began to show. My brother became restless. He'd circle conversations, fishing for affirmation. When it didn't come, his tone sharpened slightly. He tried humor, then irritation, then subtle accusations. "You seem distant lately. Did I do something?" I answered honestly but minimally. "I've just been thinking more." That was true, and it gave him nothing to push against. My parents responded differently. They filled the silence themselves. Where I once helped translate tensions, they now rushed to smooth them over before I could be drawn in. It was almost impressive how quickly they adapted. Proof that my role, while convenient, had never been irreplaceable. They just preferred it when I did it. My husband struggled the most. He sensed the shift, but couldn't locate it. I was still kind, still present, still engaged, but I no longer volunteered interpretations or emotional shortcuts. When he asked me how I felt about something my brother had done, I answered plainly, without cushioning. I noticed a pattern, I'd say. I'm not comfortable with that. I don't agree. No justifications, no preamble. He would look at me, slightly unsettled, as if waiting for the familiar softening to follow. When it didn't, he tried to supply it himself. "I'm sure he didn't mean it that way." "I'm sure he did," I replied once calmly. That was enough to change the temperature in the room. What everyone mistook for weakness was actually my refusal to explain myself anymore. I wasn't withdrawing because I was unsure. I was withdrawing because I was certain. Certainty doesn't argue, it observes. In private, I began organizing my thoughts. Not obsessively, methodically. I replayed conversations in my mind, not to relive them, but to understand their structure. Who redirected, who minimized, who benefited. Patterns emerged quickly once I stopped interrupting them with empathy. I noticed how often my brother's version of events shifted depending on the audience, how my parents adjusted their memory to match his, how my husband unconsciously mirrored whoever spoke last. None of this was malicious. It was adaptive. An adaptation, when left unexamined, becomes complicity. Still, I didn't confront anyone. Confrontation would have fed the narrative that I was emotional, reactive, and dramatic. Silence starved that story. What surprised me most was how empowering restraint felt. There is a quiet confidence in not needing to be understood by people who are invested in misunderstanding you. I no longer felt the urge to correct every distortion. I trusted that time and consistency would do that work for me. And beneath that restraint, something else was forming. Distance creates perspective, and perspective reveals leverage. I wasn't planning anything yet. I wasn't seeking revenge, but I had stopped protecting other people from the consequences of their own behavior. I let inconsistencies stand. I let discomfort linger. I let people feel the absence of the support they had taken for granted. The system began to strain, and still no one accused me of anything. That's the thing about quiet shifts. They're easy to ignore until they're impossible to reverse. By the time anyone realized that my silence was no longer submission, it would be far too late to reframe it. Because I wasn't retreating. I was repositioning. While everyone was adjusting to my quiet, something else was happening, something they never noticed, because it didn't announce itself. I was learning, not in a dramatic, late-night, conspiracy-filled way. There were no secret folders or frantic searches, just steady attention, the kind that builds when you finally stop explaining things away and start letting them mean what they are. I began keeping my leather notebook close, not to write accusations, but to log facts, dates, direct quotes, context. I didn't interpret. I didn't editorialize. I simply recorded. If something contradicted a previous statement, I noted both versions side by side and left them there. The effect was grounding. It removed emotion from the equation. When I felt doubt creep in, as it had been trained to, I could return to the page and see consistency where gaslighting once thrived. What became clear very quickly was that my brother's behavior followed a rhythm. First, he created a situation, often through omission rather than action. Then he framed himself as overwhelmed or misunderstood. If challenged, he deflected. If supported, he escalated. Accountability only appeared when there was no audience left to protect him. I also noticed how information flowed through the family. My parents acted as filters, softening his actions before passing them along, sharpening criticism when it pointed away from him. Facts were not shared neutrally, they were curated. Even my husband, who believed himself objective, absorbed these filtered narratives without realizing it. He trusted tone more than substance, and tone in my family was carefully managed. I started cross-checking, not obsessively, just enough. Conversations replayed differently when you compare them to their retellings. What someone says in private versus what they say publicly reveals more than any confession ever could. And then there was the betrayal under my roof. It didn't announce itself as betrayal. It arrived disguised as concern, as collaboration, as two people discussing me as if I weren't present, not maliciously, just conveniently. I noticed it first in fragments. A phrase my husband used that echoed my brother's wording too closely. A shared assumption that hadn't been discussed openly. A moment where a decision had been made about me, without me. The realization was slow and devastating. My husband and my family were aligning narratives around me, not against me, around me. They were trying to preserve stability by managing the truth, by deciding collectively what version of events I should accept. And they were doing it in my home, with my presence treated as a formality rather than a voice. That was when the notebook shifted from a grounding tool to a map. I didn't confront my husband, not yet. I watched. I listened to how he described my reactions to others, how he softened my certainty into stress, how he framed my silence as withdrawal rather than discernment. He thought he was protecting me. What he was actually doing was participating in the same pattern he believed he stood outside of. That was the moment I understood something critical. Loyalty, when misdirected, becomes betrayal without ever feeling like one. I also realized that I had leverage. Not because I was clever, but because I had been underestimated for so long. No one suspected I was tracking patterns. No one imagined I was capable of stepping outside the role they had assigned me. They believed my quiet meant confusion. It meant clarity. Every system has a blind spot. In mine, it was the assumption that I wouldn't act without permission, that I wouldn't move without announcing it, that I needed validation before trusting my own judgment. They were wrong. By the time I finished mapping what was happening, carefully, unemotionally, I wasn't angry. I was resolved. I understood where every line of pressure came from and where it landed. And for the first time, I could see exactly where to step without causing noise. They never noticed the preparation because it didn't look like preparation. It looked like patience, like distance, like fatigue. They mistook my restraint for resignation, and that miscalculation would cost them more than they could imagine. The reveal didn't come with a rush of adrenaline. There was no moment where everything suddenly clicked in a cinematic way. It arrived quietly, the way truth often does when you've already done most of the work to meet it. I was alone when it happened, sitting at the same kitchen table where months earlier something had shifted inside me. The notebook was open, pages filled with neat, restrained handwriting. Patterns I had already recognized were now undeniable. What I saw wasn't just dysfunction. It was coordination, not in the sense of secret meetings or malicious planning, but a shared, unspoken agreement about whose version of reality would be upheld and whose would be adjusted to fit it. My brother didn't need to explicitly ask for protection. My parents didn't need to consciously lie. My husband didn't need to intend harm. They were aligned by incentive. My brother benefited from being shielded. My parents benefited from believing they had raised a good man. My husband benefited from a marriage without conflict. And I was the variable that threatened all three. That was the private reveal. I wasn't being excluded because I was wrong. I was being excluded because I was accurate in a way that disrupted comfort. Once I saw that, the emotional fog lifted completely. I went back through the notebook, not looking for validation, but for structure. I noticed how often my brother's inconsistencies appeared around the same themes: money, responsibility, credibility. How often my parents intervened at precisely those points. How my husband's responses softened whenever those interventions occurred. It was systemic, predictable, and because it was predictable, it was manageable. I also saw something else then, something that surprised me. I had options. Until that moment, I had been psychologically cornered by the belief that my only choices were confrontation or silence, fight or submit. But clarity opened a third path: strategic disengagement paired with preparation. I didn't need to convince anyone of anything. I didn't need to expose my brother publicly or force my parents to face themselves. And I didn't need to beg my husband to choose me over comfort. I only needed to stop participating in a system that required my self-erasure. That realization was sobering, not triumphant, because it came with loss already attached. I knew instinctively that choosing myself would mean being misunderstood, possibly rejected, certainly reframed as the problem. But for the first time, I could weigh that cost honestly. I wasn't afraid of being alone. I was afraid of continuing to disappear. That afternoon, I closed the notebook and placed it back in its usual spot. Nothing outward changed. I still made dinner, I still answered questions, I still smiled when appropriate. But internally, I had crossed a line. I no longer saw myself as someone waiting to be treated fairly. I saw myself as someone deciding what I would tolerate and what I would quietly withdraw from. There was no celebration in that, just resolve. The reveal wasn't about discovering a secret. It was about accepting a truth I had long circled but never claimed. That loyalty to myself would cost me the illusion of belonging. And that the illusion was already costing me far more. That night, lying next to my husband, I listened to his breathing and understood that love, when it refuses to look at truth, becomes something fragile and conditional. I didn't hate him for that. I simply stopped protecting him from it. I fell asleep knowing that the next steps would need to be careful, measured, invisible until they were complete. Because once you see the system clearly, you don't rush to announce it. You step out of it, quietly. There comes a moment after clarity where you can no longer pretend you're undecided. For a while, I lingered there, not out of fear, but out of respect for what was at stake. I understood that whatever I chose would be irreversible, not because it would explode everything at once, but because it would quietly set things in motion that could not be undone. I laid out my options carefully, the way you do when emotion has finally stepped aside. I could confront my brother directly, say the things I'd been holding back, demand accountability. I knew exactly how that would go. Denial, deflection. My parents rushed in to soften the blow. My husband asked me later why I had to be so harsh. Nothing would change, except the narrative about me. I could confront my parents, ask them to stop protecting him, ask them to trust my perception. That option was even more fragile. It would force them to choose between truth and identity. And people rarely choose the option that destabilizes their self-concept. I could confront my husband, lay everything out, ask him to see what I saw. That one hurt the most to consider, because it required him to admit that his comfort had come at my expense. He might do it, he might not. Either way, I would be exposing myself to dismissal one last time. Or I could stop negotiating my reality altogether. That option was quieter, less dramatic, and far more powerful. It didn't require agreement. It didn't require understanding. It only required action, consistent, private, and aligned with what I knew to be true. The decision point wasn't about choosing what felt fair. It was about choosing what was effective. I thought about the years I had spent explaining myself. The energy was poured into smoothing things over, the exhaustion of being calm in spaces that demanded my erasure. I thought about the version of myself I would become if I stayed, smaller, quieter, increasingly uncertain. And then I thought about leaving, not running away, not slamming doors, just stepping out of alignment with a system that depended on my silence. The grief hit then, not in waves, but as a steady pressure. Because even when family hurts you, detaching from them means letting go of who you hoped they might be. It means accepting that love, in that form, was conditional. I didn't cry, I didn't panic. I chose. That night, I made a quiet commitment to myself. I would no longer provide emotional cover for behavior I found unethical. I would no longer explain my perceptions to people invested in disproving them. And I would no longer make decisions based on preserving other people's comfort. The choice wasn't loud, but it was absolute. From that point on, everything I did was oriented toward independence, not emotionally, but structurally. I began thinking in terms of timelines rather than reactions, of outcomes rather than arguments. I didn't announce my decision, I didn't warn anyone, and I didn't ask for permission. Because the most destabilizing thing you can do in a system built on your compliance is to quietly withdraw it. The irony is that no one noticed the moment I decided. They only noticed the consequences later. And by then, the choice had already done its work. That was the point of no return. Not because I burned bridges, but because I stopped standing on them. Once the decision was made, urgency disappeared. That surprised me. I had expected anxiety or second-guessing or some internal countdown toward confrontation. Instead, what arrived was focus, clean, directed, almost procedural. I moved in silence, not out of secrecy, but out of respect for the process. Anything worth doing carefully doesn't announce itself halfway through. The first thing I did was stop sharing my inner life. Not emotionally withdrawing, but informationally. I answered questions without offering context. I made plans without narrating them. I allowed people to assume continuity where there was none. At home, this looked like normalcy. I still cooked, still listened, still participated. But I stopped outsourcing my decision-making. I stopped checking in for approval. I trusted my own assessment of situations without waiting to see if it would be validated. In parallel, I began addressing the structural realities I had long ignored. I reviewed finances, not because I suspected wrongdoing, but because clarity requires autonomy. I learned where things were, how decisions had been made, and what assumptions were built into our shared life. I asked practical questions, calmly, without accusation. My husband answered them easily, unaware that each answer was closing a door behind me. I consulted professionals quietly, not to make accusations, but to understand options. Information, I learned, is not an act of aggression. It's an act of self-respect. I also began disentangling myself from family obligations that relied on my invisible labor. I stopped being the default mediator. I declined involvement that required me to translate or soften reality. When asked why, I kept it simple. I don't have the capacity for that right now. No elaboration, no apology. What struck me most was how little resistance there was at first. People don't notice absence immediately, especially when they've mistaken your effort for background noise. It takes time for the imbalance to register. My brother continued behaving as he always had. He assumed access. He assumed loyalty. He assumed I would adjust. My parents assumed things would smooth themselves out. They always had before. My husband assumed my calm meant acceptance, and in that assumption, they revealed their blind spot. Silence gave me space. Space gave me leverage, not over them, but over my own future. I organized documents. I made contingency plans. I aligned my actions with the reality I had accepted, rather than the one I had been pressured to perform. There was no bitterness in it, just alignment. At times, I felt the urge to explain, to say this is why I'm doing this, to justify the distance, to invite understanding. But I resisted it. Explanation would have turned preparation into negotiation, and I wasn't negotiating anymore. The quietness of that period was almost meditative. Each small step reinforced the next. Each unspoken decision strengthened my internal authority. I stopped feeling like someone reacting to circumstances and started feeling like someone shaping them. The irony was that the more grounded I became, the less anyone suspected change. Stability, after all, had always been my role. They mistook my composure for continuity. By the time subtle consequences began to surface, missed expectations, unfilled emotional gaps, decisions made without consultation, it was already too late to trace them back to a single moment. There was no dramatic reveal because there had been no dramatic move, just a woman quietly reclaiming authorship over her own life. Consequences rarely announce themselves as consequences. They arrive in confusion, as an inconvenience, as a faint sense that something essential has gone missing, even though no one can quite name what it was. The first signs appeared in my parents. They started calling more often, not with emergencies, but with vague check-ins that felt slightly off balance. Conversations drifted without the usual efficiency. Problems lingered unresolved longer than they used to. I could hear the hesitation in my mother's voice when she realized I wasn't stepping in to mediate the way I always had. She didn't accuse me of anything. Instead, she sounded disoriented. "Things just feel tense lately," she said once, as if tension were a weather pattern rather than a result of choices. I listened. I sympathized. I didn't fix. That was new. My brother felt it next, though he didn't understand it as a consequence, only as resistance. His stories became more elaborate, his explanations more defensive. Without my quiet reinforcement, his narratives met friction for the first time, not from confrontation, but from absence. When he asked for help, I responded practically, not emotionally. I offered neutral advice without rescue. When he sought validation, I stayed factual. The effect was subtle but destabilizing. He began to experience what he had long avoided, the discomfort of sitting with his own inconsistencies. My husband noticed the change differently. He couldn't point to anything specific, but the household felt less lubricated. Conversations stalled where they once flowed. Decisions felt heavier. He found himself needing to think through things he'd previously outsourced to my calm. One evening, he asked, "Have you been unhappy for a long time?" The question landed gently, but late. "I've been aware for a long time," I said, and left it at that. That answer unsettled him more than any accusation could have. The family gatherings grew quieter, not tense, just oddly incomplete. Without my invisible coordination, conversations overlapped or dropped off. Old patterns bumped into each other without being smoothed over. Small frictions went unresolved and accumulated. And still, no one blamed me. That's the thing about withdrawing invisible labor. People don't know what they've lost, only that things don't work the way they used to. My parents began to feel the weight of their choices without the buffer I had provided. They had to manage my brother directly. They had to confront moments where his stories didn't align. And without my quiet reframing, those moments lingered uncomfortably. They started asking questions they'd never asked before, not out of curiosity, but necessity. My brother responded by escalating. More explanations, more pressure, more attempts to pull me back into my old role. When that didn't work, irritation surfaced. He accused me of being distant, of changing, of thinking I was better than everyone else. I didn't defend myself, because defensiveness would have recentered the conversation around me, instead of what was finally being exposed. My husband, caught between familiarity and discomfort, tried to restore balance. He suggested family dinners, conversations, resets, but without my cooperation in smoothing things over, those efforts only highlighted how dependent the system had been on my silence. For the first time, the family experienced instability that couldn't be traced back to a single argument or event. It was structural, and structures don't collapse loudly at first. They sag, they creak, they reveal stress fractures that had always been there. I watched this unfold without satisfaction and without guilt, because none of it was caused by something I did. It was caused by something I stopped doing. That distinction mattered. I wasn't punishing anyone. I wasn't withholding out of spite. I was simply no longer compensating for a system that required my self-erasure to function. And slowly, inevitably, they began to feel the absence of the person they had relied on, without ever truly seeing. By the time panic arrived, it wore the mask of concern. My parents were the first to shift from confusion to urgency. Their calls became more frequent, their voices tighter. They asked how I was doing, but the question carried an undercurrent. Are you still with us? They sensed the change but misdiagnosed its cause. We should all sit down and talk, my mother suggested one afternoon. Clear the air. Clear the air. The phrase implied mutual misunderstanding, a shared responsibility, as if what had happened was fog rather than erosion. I didn't refuse. I didn't agree. I said, we can talk if there's something specific you want to address. There wasn't, because specificity would have required naming patterns they had spent years avoiding. My brother reacted differently. His panic was louder, though still indirect. He oscillated between charm and accusation. One moment, he was reminiscing about childhood, trying to re-anchor me to a version of myself that had been compliant. Next, he was irritated, hinting that I'd become cold, judgmental, and unfair. You've changed, he said, as if it were an indictment. Yes, I replied. No explanation, no apology. That single word unsettled him more than anything else I could have said. My husband, meanwhile, began to understand that something irreversible was unfolding. He noticed the way I made decisions without looping him in, the way I no longer sought reassurance after family interactions, the way my calm had shifted from accommodating to self-contained. One night, he asked me directly if I was planning to leave. I'm planning to live honestly, I said. That answer scared him. He tried to initiate the conversations he should have had years earlier. He asked questions, listened more carefully, and acknowledged some things he had previously minimized. And for a moment, I could see the man I had hoped he might become sooner. But timing matters. Awareness that arrives only when consequences appear isn't transformation, it's reaction. I didn't reject his efforts. I simply didn't rush to reassure him that they would be enough, because I needed to see consistency, not urgency. The family meeting eventually happened, not because clarity emerged, but because discomfort demanded it. We sat around the table, familiar positions, familiar dynamics. Only this time, I didn't perform. My parents spoke in generalities. My brother defended himself without being accused. My husband tried to mediate, and I listened. When they finally turned to me, asking how I felt, I answered calmly, I've been living in a reality that wasn't acknowledged here. I won't do that anymore. Silence followed. They wanted details, examples, proof, something to debate. I offered none, not because I didn't have it, but because this wasn't a trial. It was a boundary. You're shutting us out, my mother said, hurt in her voice. No, I replied. I'm no longer carrying what isn't mine. That was the moment they realized they couldn't fix this by talking, because what they were trying to fix wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the loss of access. Access to my emotional labor, access to my flexibility, access to my willingness to doubt myself for their comfort. They had waited too long to notice the cost of taking those things for granted. And now, even their regret couldn't restore what had been quietly withdrawn. The confrontation everyone had been bracing for never arrived in the form they expected. There was no shouting, no tears, no catalog of grievances was delivered with trembling hands. What finally happened was quieter, and because of that, far more unsettling for them. It was just my brother and me. No parents to mediate, no husband to soften the edges. He asked to meet, framing it as a desire to clear things up. I agreed, not because I believed clarity was his goal, but because I was no longer avoiding anything. We sat across from each other in a neutral space. He looked tense, rehearsed. I looked the same as I always did. That imbalance alone put him on edge. He started by explaining himself. Again, long circular justifications, familiar reframing. The same stories I had heard in different forms for years. I let him finish without interruption. When he paused, waiting for my response, I didn't correct him. I know, I said. He blinked. You know what? I know how you tell these stories. I know what you leave out. I know when you shift details depending on who's listening. His posture changed. Not defensive yet, testing. That's not fair, he said. You're making me sound like I'm doing this on purpose. I'm not assigning intent, I replied calmly. I'm describing behavior. He tried to pull me into a debate, asked for examples, challenged my memory, invited me, once again, to doubt myself. I didn't engage. This isn't a conversation where I prove anything to you, I said. I'm telling you what I see, and what I'm no longer willing to participate in. That was when frustration surfaced. "So what, you think you're better than everyone now?" he asked. "No," I said. "I think I'm done pretending not to notice." That landed harder than an accusation ever could. He leaned back, arms crossed. "You're blowing this out of proportion." "Maybe," I said, "but the proportion is no longer your decision." There was a long silence then. Not the comfortable kind. The kind where someone realizes the tactics they've relied on no longer work. "You're tearing the family apart," he said quietly. I met his eyes. No, I stopped holding it together by disappearing. For the first time, he didn't have a response ready. The confrontation ended without resolution, without apology, without reconciliation. And that was exactly the point, because I hadn't gone there to change him. I had gone there to mark the boundary, clearly, calmly, and without negotiation. In the days that followed, the narrative shifted quickly. I became cold, unforgiving, hard to reach. My parents echoed his confusion. My husband struggled with the discomfort of seeing me so immovable. But none of that mattered anymore. I had spoken the truth without heat, without cruelty, without needing agreement. And when truth is delivered that way, people can't dismiss it as emotion. They have to sit with it, or move away from it. Some chose distance. I let them. Who I am now doesn't look dramatic from the outside. There was no reinvention montage, no sudden confidence, no hardened edge. I didn't become louder, sharper, or more confrontational. If anything, I became quieter, but with a different center of gravity. I am no longer oriented around being understood. That single shift changed everything. I wake up without rehearsing conversations in my head. I make decisions without running them through imaginary committees of approval. I notice discomfort without rushing to dissolve it. Peace, I've learned, isn't the absence of tension. It's the absence of self-betrayal. My relationship with my husband changed irrevocably. We didn't separate immediately. We had long, honest conversations. Real ones, not the soothing kind. He saw things he couldn't unsee. He admitted where he had chosen ease over truth. Some days, that awareness brought us closer. Other days, it exposed how different our thresholds really were. I stopped trying to close that gap for him. Whether we ultimately stayed together wasn't the defining outcome. What mattered was that I no longer contorted myself to preserve an image of harmony. I let the relationship become what it actually was, not what it needed me to pretend it was. With my parents, the distance settled into something quieter and sadder. They reached out less. When they did, they avoided specifics. I could feel the effort it took for them to interact without leaning on old dynamics. Sometimes I caught glimpses of regret. Other times, denial. I didn't chase either. My brother became a peripheral figure in my life. Not erased, not forgiven, not punished. Simply repositioned. Without my participation, his stories lost traction. He moved on to audiences more receptive to his version of events. And I let him. The most profound change was internal. I trust myself out. Not because I'm infallible, but because I no longer outsource my reality. If something feels off, I don't immediately look for reasons to dismiss that feeling. I investigate it, calmly, carefully, without apology. I've learned that quiet strength isn't about endurance. It's about discernment. Knowing when to step back and when to step out entirely. There are moments of loneliness. That's the part people don't talk about. When you stop performing a role that kept systems stable, you lose access to the familiarity that role provided. Even when it hurt, it had a rhythm. But loneliness with integrity is different from a connection that requires self-erasure. I don't feel bitterness toward my family. Bitterness comes from unexpressed truth. Mine has been expressed, cleanly, calmly, without spectacle. What remains is acceptance. I accept that not everyone who loves you is capable of being fair to you. I accept that truth often costs you proximity. And I accept that the version of me they preferred was the one who made their lives easier, not the one who lived honestly. Who I am now is someone who can sit with that without flinching. That's not dominance in the traditional sense. It's something quieter. There's a particular kind of grief that comes when you realize the people who taught you to value honesty were only comfortable with it as long as it didn't challenge them. It doesn't explode, it settles. For a long time, I thought being cast out meant being rejected loudly. Arguments, ultimatums, severed ties. What I learned instead is that exclusion often happens quietly. You stop being consulted. Your clarity becomes inconvenient. Your presence feels conditional. And eventually, you're positioned as the problem, not because you caused harm, but because you refuse to carry it silently. The moral of this story isn't that families are cruel or that truth always destroys connection. It's subtler than that. Families, like all systems, adapt to protect what they value most. Sometimes that's love, sometimes it's comfort, sometimes it's a story about themselves they can't afford to question. When you become the one who sees through that story, you threaten more than behavior. You threaten identity. That's why the truth teller is often isolated, not because they're wrong, but because they're early. What I want you to take from this isn't encouragement to confront, expose, or retaliate. Loudness isn't the answer to invisibility. Awareness is it. Pay attention to how often you're praised for being easy when what you're really doing is absorbing discomfort that isn't yours. Notice when your clarity is reframed as negativity. Notice who benefits when you doubt yourself. And most importantly, notice what happens when you stop compensating. You don't have to announce boundaries to make them real. You don't have to prove your experience to validate it. And you don't have to stay in systems that require you to disappear to function. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about control over what you participate in. I didn't win anything by telling this story. I lost access to a version of belonging that had always been conditional. What I gained was something sturdier: alignment, self-trust, and the ability to live without rehearsing my existence. If this story resonated with you, it might be because you felt that quiet pressure too. The pressure to stay small so others can stay comfortable. And if that's the case, I want to ask you something, not as a challenge, but as an invitation to reflect. Have you ever been treated as difficult simply because you refused to pretend not to see what was right in front of you? If you're willing, share your experience in the comments. Not to relive it, but to name it. Sometimes naming is the first act of reclaiming yourself.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.